Since the universe is a big place, we could easily get lost. So we'll need signposts to give us a sense of scale. The Acrobat's ring is 1 meter wide. The crowd is 10 times wider, 10 meters across, larger by 1 power of 10. Now, with every step, every ring, we travel 10 times farther from Venice, and our view of the universe is 10 times wider. The 100-meter ring surrounds St. Mark's, and 1,000 meters, 1 kilometer, the city center. As our speed increases, 4 steps, 4 powers of 10, reveal all the islands of Venice, the Adriatic Sea, and the mainland of northern Italy. Six steps take in Europe from central Germany across Italy to the Balkans. And soon we can see the entire planet, our home in space. Eight steps on our outward journey, 8 powers of 10, and we pass the farthest reaches of human travel, the moon. If we visualize the paths that the 9 planets take in their orbits around the Sun, at 13 steps from St. Mark's Square, the entire solar system comes into view. And with 15 steps, 15 powers of 10, we can see that our Sun is just another star. From here on, our voyage will be measured in light years, the distance light travels in an entire year. Only now do we fly past our nearest neighbor stars, almost 5 light years away. The same journey at the speed of today's spacecraft would last 100,000 years. As we cross the perpetual night, our voyage takes us up and out of our Sun's neighborhood near the edge of a great pinwheel of stars. The Milky Way is actually a spiral galaxy, and our own Sun is just one of 100 billion stars in it. At this immense scale, 23 powers of 10, each shining light we see is not a star, but an entire galaxy, composed of countless stars. Astronomers have discovered that the galaxies are flying away from one another. The universe is expanding. Our own galaxy and all the others form clusters and superclusters of stupendous size, hundreds of millions of light years across. And here, about 15 billion light years from Venice, we approach the outer limits of the visible universe. What lies beyond this cosmic horizon, we cannot see and do not know.
Well, I shared this video, the same video, maybe a different version of this, back about 3 years ago when I did this message on worship, or what is worship. And so I've seen this video several times since then, but every time that I watch it, there's a certain point in watching the video where even this week, had to turn away from the screen because I almost had a panic attack. Because in this particular video, after it shows the expanse of the universe, then all of a sudden it zooms in quickly back down to Earth and then to the infinite smallness of the universe, and it's really crazy. In fact, I had a similar experience when I downloaded this app on my iPhone. It's called Sky Guide. And it's actually a fun and informative little app that you can put on your phone. And I have it up here on the screen to demonstrate it for you. But basically, you hold up your phone, and as you point it in any direction like this, it shows you all of the constellations that are in the sky, even when it's daytime. It's quite awesome until I made the mistake of then pointing it down to my feet, and you could see the expansive universe below you, and I again almost had an anxiety attack because I felt like I was staring at this unnerving sense that I was staring down into this deep, dark, eternal abyss. So there's something about the size and the scale of the universe that has that effect on some of us more cowardly people. I can remember being a little boy laying awake at night, maybe 4, 5 years old, and I was wondering how far you can travel through space until you would finally come to the end of it. And then I would startle myself out of bed as, again, I was gripped with this terror and fear. And maybe some of you have experienced that, right? This is just me. Anyway, well, as I was preparing this message, I stopped to consider why that is, because I know I'm not alone. As I read the comments of this video that I just shared with you here with Morgan Freeman talking through it, there was a lot of other people in the comment section of that video talking about how they had this same fear or sense of terror when they were faced with how huge the universe is. And as I considered that, the conclusion that I came to is the reason that happens is because we as human beings, we are not often faced with the idea of things that last forever and ever and ever. Our experience in this life tells us that everything, even good things, eventually come to an end. That's because we're so driven by time and our day-to-day, hour by hour, minute by minute routine of living life on this planet. So much that it's not really until we experience, for example, the pain of losing someone to some illness or some tragedy, that we stop to consider those things pertaining to eternity, and when we're somewhat forced to ask some of life's deeper questions. Well, I think that when you look into the night sky, it kind of has that same effect on us. You're faced, as we look up to the infinite sky, we're faced with the idea that things go on, at least in terms of the universe, go on forever and ever and ever. And staring into the face of the universe, or staring into the universe, is like staring into the face of eternal God. It's almost as if you can't help but ask yourself the question of how it all came into existence. For example, if this universe all came into existence, all started because of a big bang, well, we really have to ask ourselves this question. Where did this initial form of matter that exploded, where did that come from? Did it just always exist? It was just always there? That doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. It had to come from somewhere or someone, which leads to an even bigger question. If it was created by someone, well, who created or what created it? And maybe more importantly, what is the nature of the force that created it? Is it good? He good? Why did he create it? Why did he create us? What is it all about? These are all very, very, very profound questions that people have been wrestling with for a long time. Pastor James showed me this cartoon that was created after the Hubble telescope pointed to a little speck in the sky about the size of a grain of sand. And in that focused point, what the Hubble telescope picked up was thousands of galaxies in just one pinpoint in the sky. It's crazy. And in these cartoon characters are pondering what it all means, and in coming to their conclusion of what it all means and what is the purpose behind it all, what is the center of it all, the characters say, well, what's the center of it all? Me, baby. Me. Right? And when I first looked at that cartoon, I felt, as maybe you do, you feel almost compelled to correct these characters for being so arrogant to think that somehow the vastness of the universe and the overwhelming sense that we are hardly a drop of water in a deep ocean and compared to it all, that somehow it's about them. But as I thought about it, that's not really all that far from the truth. Listen to what King David said after pondering the same questions about the universe. So, when I look at the night sky, he said, and see the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you set in place, what are mere mortals that you should even think about them? Human beings that you should care for them. And yet, you made them only a little lower than God and crowned them with glory and honor. So for the most part, even as Bible-believing Christians, I don't think that many of us feel as significant as David obviously did as he wrote this psalm and reflected on his own mortality. I think that when we're honest, many of us mostly feel like God is distant and he's kind of far off and not all that concerned with what's going on in our lives or on this earth. He's like an absentee landlord, is what the devil would have us believe. But what I hope to communicate to you guys this morning is, as we look at Psalm 19, is that in the entire storyline of the Bible, we see that it's all about this awesome, all-powerful, unfathomable, eternal creator of the universe who went to extreme lengths to demonstrate that he does care. We're not alone. In fact, we are the focus of the Creator's love. And we see this through creation. He speaks that out. We see through his spoken word that he's saying that. And then we also see it in his word becoming flesh and blood and dwelling among us. God is shouting out through all of those things this wonderful message that he's very concerned with what's going on in our lives and that he loves us. And so if you have your Bibles, I'd love it if you turn to Psalm chapter 19 because we're going to walk through the whole thing. Psalm 19, if you don't have a Bible, there's one located conveniently underneath your seat. Otherwise, you can look here on the screen. And just a quick note before we get started, and hopefully this little bit of info will help you follow me a little bit more easily. Psalm 19 is laid out in three distinct parts. The first section is all about God revealed in creation. All right. The second part is God revealed through his word, through law, through his commandments. And then third, God, and this is the way I'm going to frame this, is the third section is God revealing our need for a Savior. So we'll start Psalm chapter 19, verses 1 through 4, where David says this: "The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands, and day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they display knowledge. There's no speech or language where their voice is not heard. Their voice goes out into all the earth, and their words to the ends of the world." And very simply, David's telling us here in these first few verses that there's an important message that's being communicated to us through creation. And that message is something that David is saying transcends the language barrier. The way the Message version says it here, their words aren't heard, their voices aren't recorded, but unspoken truth is spoken everywhere. And the truth that is being declared through creation is that there is a creator, and the heavens, the sky, the stars, the universe, they declare his glory, and the skies, they proclaim the works of his hands. And it's so obvious that you almost have to intentionally close your mind and your eyes to it in order to not see it. And many have and do choose to do that, as we know. The evidence, as I discovered this week, did a lot of studying, and I learned that the universe and all the evidence that scientists have gleaned throughout the centuries, it all points overwhelmingly that there is an intelligent designer at work here. It's so overwhelming that scientists are now beginning to promote the idea of intelligent design because they've come to believe that there's just too much complexity, from the great way in which the stars and everything just moves, as well down to DNA and the way the atoms all come together to create matter. And they a lot of them have a hard time believing that things just are a happy accident and it just kind of came together by natural selection. It's just there's a former scientist who became an agnostic who wrote a book called God and the Astronomers. This is from an interview in Christianity Today that he said this. Listen, astronomers now find that they have painted themselves into a corner because they've proven by their own methods that the world began abruptly in an act of creation to which you can trace the seeds of every star, every planet, every living thing in the cosmos and on Earth. And they found that all this happened as a product of forces they can't hope to discover. That there are what I or anyone would call supernatural forces at work is now, I think, a scientifically proven fact. Now, again, I want to remind you that just because this was in Christianity Today, this man was not a Christian. He was kind of an agnostic. He believed that there was some force out there. He didn't call him Yahweh, God. But again, this guy did not have a religious agenda in making this statement. He was just a scientist, simply stating what he believed to be the obvious facts, obvious conclusions, given the evidence that they've been presented with. The same thing happened when one of the most fierce opponents of Christianity, a man by the name of Antony Flew, who used to debate folks like C.S. Lewis back in the day. This guy was a real God hater. This man even came to believe in a creator of some sort. Again, not in God of the Bible, but a belief that, okay, somehow this is not just an accident. Listen to what he said a few years before he died. I now believe there is a God, almost entirely because of the DNA investigations. What I think the DNA material has done is that it's shown by the almost unbelievable complexity of the arrangements which are needed to produce life, that intelligence must have been involved in getting these extraordinarily diverse elements to work together. You should download the man's book on how he came to know God. It's absolutely fascinating. So, like the other gentleman that I just quoted, who wrote that other book, Antony was not a Bible-believing Christian. There was not a religious agenda behind the statements that he makes about the conclusions that he came to after seeing the evidence. He's just communicating what the evidence pointed to. And there's several other scientists who are saying the same thing, and yet millions of people around the world continue to ignore the evidence. They ignore the message that God is communicating to them through creation, the bigness of it, all the way to the complex things that we see in the smallness. And we see this talked about in the book of Romans chapter 1, where the Apostle Paul says that forever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and the sky. Through everything God made, they can clearly see his invisible qualities, his eternal power, his divine nature. So they have no excuse for not knowing God. Yeah, they knew God, but they wouldn't worship him as God or even give him thanks. And because of that, they began to think up these foolish ideas of who God was like or what God was like. And as a result, their minds became dark and confused. Claiming to be wise, they instead became utter fools. Now, these two men that I was talking about, just two examples, Robert Jastrow and Antony Flew, these two men were humble enough to look at the complexity of the world and the evidence that they were presented with, and they took all of that and they recognized the invisible qualities and the eternal power of the one who created it all. That's pretty amazing. And yet, unfortunately, the sad reality is that while they were able to recognize that some creative force created the world and the universe, they could not bring themselves to the point of coming to faith in the God who's described in the scriptures. See, it's one thing to believe that some god or goddess or intelligent force created the universe. A lot of folks believe that. Wiccans, Buddhists, Hindus, a lot of other religions believe that to be true as well. A lot of them believe that there's a God or some multiplicity of gods. But it's another thing to have a relationship with the living God who's described in the Bible. See, there's a limit to what we can know about God through creation. Yeah, he's communicating a message. You're not alone. I've created it. But again, there's limits to to what we can know about God by just looking or gazing at the stars in the sky. As powerful as the voice of creation might be in communicating the glory of God, God, in his infinite wisdom, knew that we needed a more clear and concise revelation of who he is. And so throughout the Bible, we see that God spoke to prophets throughout history to tell us exactly what he was like and how he expects us to interact with him and how we should live our lives in light of who he is. And one of the most clear revelations that we've got about God, it was when he came down and communicated who he was and who we need to be to a man named Moses on Mount Sinai when he gave him all those laws and commandments. So listen to how, now as we continue looking at Psalm 19, how David describes the second way in which God reveals himself to us, that being his law and commandments, where he says this: "The instructions of the Lord are perfect, reviving the soul. The decrees of the Lord are trustworthy, making wise the simple. The commandments of the Lord are right, bringing joy to the heart. The commands of the Lord are clear, giving insight for living. Reverence for the Lord is pure, lasting forever. The laws of the Lord are true, each one is fair. They are more desirable than gold, even the finest gold. And they are sweeter than honey, even honey dripping from the comb. They are a warning to your servant and a great reward for those who obey them." He's speaking very highly of God's law and his commandments. And a lot of us are often tempted to think that God's laws and commandments are a drag or a wet blanket on all the fun that we think we want to have. But in reality, again, as we see here in this psalm, and it's confirmed by the Apostle Paul, that God's laws and commandments are good. And the reason they are good is because they communicate to us God's character. They tell us, they reflect who he is. In fact, when you study God's law, you begin to see that many of the characteristics that are used to describe the law are used to describe God. I have this really cool chart that I found that helps make this a little bit more clear. Now, this is just a few examples, but for instance, the Word of God says that he is good. It also says that the law is good. God is just. The law is just. God is true. The Word is true. God is light. The Word is light, and so on it goes. And there's scriptures there that show you the parallels. In the same way, when you look at the commandments found, just let's look at the top 10. But you can learn a lot about who God is through his commandments. When it says, honor your father and your mother, well, that communicates to us that God, he's a God of relationship. Relationships are important to him. And he cares about the family ties that bind us together in unity. This tells us something about God. When the other, don't commit murder. Well, that communicates that God places a high value on human life and that we shouldn't harm one another. The command that says we shouldn't covet or steal. Well, what that tells us about God, that he's a God that is generous. He's a generous giver, and because of that, he wants us to be people that are givers rather than selfish takers. The command that says we shouldn't commit adultery, that communicates that God, he's always faithful in all of his relationships. And because of that, he expects that we would be the same. We would act in that same way of faithfulness. So again, what I'm getting at here is that God's laws and commandments, they're a good thing because they tell us ultimately who God is. They give us a more clear picture of who he is, and they speak to his character and how we should behave and believe and respond to him. But just like with creation, there's the revelation of that there is a God, there's a creator. That's spoken of in creation. But now then he comes and there's a revelation of who he is through his laws and commandments. But again, as with creation, there's limits to what the law and the commandments can communicate to us. In fact, I don't know which chapter, I think it's Galatians chapter 3, where the Apostle Paul says that the law is like a schoolmaster. It's like a tutor that's leading us to an even deeper revelation of who God is. See, the difficulty with the law, as good as it is that we inevitably fail to measure up to it. We fail to measure up to God's righteous standard. And when we do, see, what happens is we have this tendency to fall right back to square one, where we feel alone, and as though God is distant from us because of our sin. We think, well, I blew it, now God's he's moving away from me, and now there's this distance created between us because of our failures, and we feel that, we experience guilt and shame. We see this in Psalm 51 where the psalmist, I believe it's David, saying, oh Lord, don't cast me away from your presence. And so we see a little bit of the tension here in Psalm 19 as we continue. This is verses 12 through 14, where he says, how can I know all the sins lurking in my heart? Cleanse me from these hidden faults. Keep your servant from deliberate sins. Don't let them control me. Then I will be free. Then I will be free from guilt and innocent of great sin. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasing to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. David recognizes that the law is good. It reflects God's character. But in light of how good and holy God's laws and commandments are and how good and holy God is, the psalmist here, David, he also recognizes his failure to measure up to God's good law and his righteous standard. And so that's why when you read many of the Psalms, you see that there's these moments where the psalmist recognizes his sin and his failures, and he expresses this deep concern and even fear that God would remove his spirit from him. That God would remove his presence from him. And I suppose back in the day that was kind of true, because we know that God removed his spirit from King Saul. So yeah, that kind of happened back then. And you know what? The thing is, many of us worry about the same thing, that in our sin that God's going to remove his presence from us and that he's going to become distant and far away. But there's something that's been revealed to us, something that we know that David didn't know. I mean, he had glimpses of it, but something that he didn't know as he wrote this psalm, because God hadn't revealed it yet. And it's this. It's found in John chapter 1, verses 14 through 19. Again, God revealed in creation, God revealed in his word, and now this. The word became human and made his home among us. He was full of unfailing love and faithfulness, and we've seen his glory, the glory of the Father's one and only Son. John the Baptist testified about him, and when he shouted to the crowds, "This is the one I was talking about when I said, 'Someone is coming after me who's far greater than I am, for he existed long before me.'" From his abundance we've all received one gracious blessing after another. For the law was given through Moses, but God's unfailing love and his faithfulness came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, but the unique one, who is himself God, is near to the Father's heart, and he has revealed God to us. Again, I'm trying to say this over and over again. God revealed himself in creation, but it was very limited what can be revealed by just staring up at the sky. And so because of that, God revealed himself to us through his word, through his commandments, through his laws. But again, there's limits to that. That's not the ultimate revelation of who God is. And so just to make sure we really, really, really got the message, God revealed himself to us through his Son, Jesus, who is the exact representation of his being. That's why Jesus said, "When you see me, you have seen the Father." The Word became flesh. The infinite God of the universe became like one of us. This is a crazy thing. God is so much bigger than we could ever conceive. If you get a panic attack from just seeing the grand nature of the universe, to even think that God's outside of that. He's not even in it like that. He's outside of it. But our big God made himself small. Stepped into creation so that he could relate to you and me on a personal level, so that we could have a relationship with him. God humbled himself. Literally, he came down to our level. And now our God knows what it is to be human and to experience pain and suffering and all of those things that we are very well acquainted with. And because of that, he can empathize with our weaknesses. It's so amazing. God's ultimate revelation of himself in the person of Jesus. It's incredible because he didn't come in greatness and power and majesty and splendor. He instead chose to come down as a humble, kind, and loving servant who gave his life away so that we could really understand God's heart for us, and that being that he loves us and he truly cares for us. I'm going to share this last scripture with you. It's the book of Colossians, where it says this, and I think this is fascinating because it just magnifies the great sacrifice that Jesus went through so that we could be in relationship with him. It says this: Christ is the visible image of the invisible God. He existed before anything was created, and he is supreme over all creation. For through him, God created everything in the heavenly realms and here on earth. He made things we can see and the things we can't see, such as thrones, kingdoms, rulers, authorities in the unseen world, the stars in the universe, all the way down to the smallest atom. Everything was created through him and for him. He existed before anything else, and he holds all things together. Again, I hope you catch this, but it's everything was created through him and for him. He truly is the center of it all, the creator of it and the center of it, and yet still, he turns his attention to you. And he's saying, I love you. And if you were the only person in the world, he would have laid his life down for you or for me. The grand nature of how big the universe is only serves to magnify the beauty and the power of the fact that the God of the universe became small. God, through Christ, draws close to each one of us, which means that you, as much as you might feel like it sometimes, you are not alone. And God, in fact, does care for you. He loves those who are broken, afraid. He's not far away. In fact, he is closer than a brother or sister. It's a beautiful fact. So this is a very simple message. It's not all that complicated. In fact, I'm pretty much done here. And the point is this. Psalm 19, what we've just read, is God's revelation of himself, saying that the message is clear. You can see it in creation. But if that weren't clear enough, he's communicated who he is through his word. If that wasn't good enough for us to catch it, then the word, became flesh and dwelt among us. And it's declared, this universal message, it's poured out day after day on sunny days like this. It's very clear to see that there is a creator. And yet the world chooses to ignore that fact. They reject him because they want to live life the way that they want to live their life. They purposely close their mind to the truth and they ignore it. And I think that we should be concerned about those people who choose to stand in their unbelief. We should be committed. It should give us that much more of a drive to communicate the gospel through our words and through our actions. So that is true. But as much as we should be concerned about those kind of folks, I think that we should be equally concerned about the implications of what happens in our heart and our minds and our spirit and our soul when we fail to truly believe this message is true, that God is deeply concerned for you, that he cares about you, the fact that you are not alone, and that he's demonstrated his love for us by stepping out from his throne and coming down here to be among us. And I guess what I mean is that many of us, in spite of the fact that we hear that he loves you, he's not mad at you, you're not alone, many of us walk through this life feeling inadequate. We feel insignificant, like we don't even matter to anybody. Nobody cares about us. That's what we feel. We feel unworthy. We feel unlovable. And what happens when we walk through life that way, practically speaking, we're acting like atheists. We're acting like unbelievers. And so most of us spend a lot of our time trying to gain the approval of God or the approval of others through self-effort. And in a lot of ways, we do that in sinful, destructive manner. So what would it be like if we truly believed that God absolutely loves us, and that even in our feelings of inadequacy and loneliness, that we are deeply loved by the one who created this incredible, complex universe? God is sending out a message to you today. And it's simply that he exists, and he loves you, and he cared enough to create you and to show you his love through his son, Jesus.